Good evening, folks. I'm going to wait for a couple of people to get on here and then we'll get started. Let's see here. All right, we are going to be in Genesis chapters 15 and probably 16 tonight. It's funny because with all this coronavirus craziness going on, they canceled school tomorrow, so I don't have to be there. And I'll get to hang out with the kids all day long, but I'll probably stay up a little bit later tonight. Michael, thank you for joining. We'll try to get 2 chapters in tonight. As always, I'll be reading out of the King James, but I'll have the ESV open up, and plus I'll have some original language resources and stuff. Typically, my stuff comes straight out of the Bible. I don't refer to commentaries as authoritative. Hey, Mom, welcome aboard. That's not to say that commentaries don't have their place, but I don't refer to them when I'm trying to teach or to make a point. I believe that commentaries are useful in the way that listening to a preacher or you guys listening to me and us having a conversation here. We can work through things and we can get a benefit from them, but I won't ever refer to them as some source of authority. So the main things that I use when I teach are just the Bible and some original language stuff, some search engines, that kind of thing. So, but I'll be reading out of the King James, and I'll have the ESV available for some clarification type stuff. Tonight's gonna be pretty interesting, I think. There's a few details. I wouldn't call them trivia because they're not trivial, but some details that we normally don't hear about. Oh my gosh, Steven, you're hilarious. Steven's over here, coronavirus jokes. Man, I'll tell you what, that gift, that has not stopped giving. There have been memes all day long, and I have been laughing my head off. So, and that's, again, there's definitely a serious side to it, but because it's such a panic and so crazy, hyped up way beyond what it should be, it's good to kind of laugh at these things, I think. So anyway, we're going to get started, and I hope you are edified by this. And if you have questions, please post them. I'm monitoring the comments as we go along, and as I see them, I'll respond to them as always. Genesis chapter 15, verse 1. After these things, the word of Jehovah came unto Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield, and thy exceeding great reward. So it's interesting because Abram has left the land of Ur. He's been sojourning for, we're going to see here, about 9 years, if I remember correctly. So a lot of the stuff that we've been reading since chapter 12 is only been roughly 10 years or so. And he is almost constantly talking with God. This is still a time that patriarchs, we call this the patriarchal age for a reason. But during this time, Jehovah is still walking with and talking with certain people. He started to distance himself from all people, so that he's not talking with everyone like I believe he did before the flood. But God is still walking and talking with men like Abram, and he's setting things in motion. We see in Ezekiel some visions of wheels and things being turned and stuff, and it's the symbolic idea of the machinations of God working through the nations. And so this is kind of the beginning of that. And so he tells Abram, I am your shield and I am your exceeding great reward. And Abram said, and this is Adonai Yehovah. So this time the word Lord is not translated from Jehovah, but the word God is. So that's interesting. But it's Lord Jehovah. What will you give me, seeing I go childless? And the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus. So Abram he's conversing. He's not challenging God, I don't think, in the sense of, come on, God, you promised me this. Where is it at? I think he's just asking a question in the way that a child might ask a dad, hey, can we have a cookie? Or, hey, Dad, can we go to a movie or something like that? So it's not a disrespectful question here. And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. So Abram has set up this guy Eliezer, who is the steward of his house, the guy that kind of is the head over all the daily workings. He's not a direct descendant of Abram, but he is related to him, and he is currently the heir of everything that Abram has. Verse 4, Behold, the word of Jehovah came unto him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, that he that shall come forth out of thine own bowels shall be thine heir. So remember, Abram doesn't have any children, and at this point in time, he's already past 80. And he brought him forth abroad, and said, Look now toward heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, So shall thy seed be. So, interesting fact. Of course, you get the physics side of this with me because of my background. When you look up into the sky without the help of modern technology, the amount of stars that you can see from any hemisphere, wherever you happen to be standing on any given night, even if you're looking at the Milky Way, is actually just a few thousand stars. So when Jehovah tells him, look up at the stars and number the stars, if Abram had actually sat down and counted them, which would have been kind of hard to do in a single night as the earth is rotating and all that, but if he had sat down and counted them, we find out that God actually blesses Abram way beyond this promise. And we're talking just the physical descendants. When we get into the nation of Israel, by the time we're up to the time of Christ, from the time of Abram all the way to the time of Christ, the number of descendants that Abram has is way beyond the stars that he could have counted. Hey, Jennifer, welcome aboard. So, just a bit of an interesting fact. Now, we obviously know that there are far more stars in the universe than just a few thousand. But that's not what he says. He says, look and see. This is the number that you can count. And so I just thought that's an interesting fact that God blesses us even more than what he says he does. So he offers this blessing, and then God takes it much farther than what he says. So, hey Solomon, welcome aboard. We are in verse 6. And he believed Jehovah, he believed in Jehovah, and he counted it to him for righteousness. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this because we get into this in the New Testament a lot. Before the cross, before Christ came and paid the price of redemption for all of us, mankind was lost, and there wasn't any way under either the patriarchal system or the law of Moses for man to be redeemed from his sins. So what happens is when a man sins, he incurs a debt. It's kind of an accounting type principle, the way that it's spoken of. And he incurs this debt, and he has no way to pay it. And so what happens is that under the Old Testament, God, who is eternal, just a pair of binoculars. Yeah, it totally does. Stephen, that's exactly right. But what God does is he says, all right, you are obediently faithful to me. He says that you are believing the things that I'm saying. You are following after my promises, or you're following after my commands, and you're believing the promises I'm giving you. And so I'm going to write a note over here on the credit side of the ledger. You've got a debt over here, but I've got a credit side of the ledger where I'm going to impute to you a righteousness because of your obedient faith. And when my promises come to fruition in Christ, in the Messiah that I'm going to send, Abram knows that all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. All the nations of the earth will have access to salvation. That God can balance the ledger. He can impute that debt. It isn't an actual cleansing of sin. It isn't actually a paying. The blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin. We read that in Hebrews. Hey, don't do that, please. Thank you. My little one's over here watching some educational videos on the skeletal system because my dog just finished up chewing up a bone and got to the marrow, and so we talked about the blood cells being created in the marrow and stuff like that. So she's fascinated. She's been watching now for about 30 minutes and has been utterly silent. So that's awesome. So anyway, we have this idea here of Jehovah writing the balance of the debt over on the right hand side, looking forward to Christ, because remember, God is eternal. He sees the entire time stream. And so you have men who are faithful, who are obedient servants of God, like Abram, who, even though they have sinned, when they go to Hades, they go to the paradise side of Hades and they await the Messiah. And then we see in the New Testament after the cross that they are said to be in the kingdom. So that debt gets paid, that imputed righteousness is held over, so that when Christ comes and he pays the redeemed or the redemption cost, then that ledger balances and the sin debt is paid for those who have had their righteousness imputed to them. Now, we still have righteousness imputed to us, but ours is a real salvation. We're not waiting for, it's not a promissory note. It's not a looking forward kind of thing. It's a different way, because Christ has already paid the debt from our perspective. And so as soon as we are immersed into Christ, that blood cleanses us and the debt is covered. And so there's a different yeah, it is fascinating. It's very fascinating, Stephen. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up. I know that there's a lot of people who will talk about that, but what it boils down to is that the people in the Old Testament are generally considered to be saved the same way that people in the New Testament are, and it's by grace, by God's gift, which we can talk another time about what that is specifically. It's basically Jesus, but grace operates through obedient faith. That is that God gives grace to everybody. Everybody has access to God's gift, but not everybody obtains salvation. And so grace actually has to work through a conduit. I actually have an article up on my website called Cause and Conduit. Grace is the cause of salvation, but the conduit is always obedient faith. James 2 talks about faith without works, so you can separate faith and obedience in a logical way. They are not the same thing. But obedient faith is one where the faith is active and you're obeying God's commands, you're doing things. It's not meritorious, it's not earning anything. It's just fulfilling the conditions that God has laid out to say, this is what you need to do to access my grace. And so that's what Abraham is doing here. He believed Jehovah and God counted it to him for righteousness. God continues on in verse 7, and he said unto him, I am Jehovah that brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldees, to give thee this land to inherit it. And he said, Jehovah God, that's Lord Jehovah, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it? So Abram's like, how do I know that I'm going to inherit? What's going to be the indication that I'm going to inherit it? And he said unto him, take me a heifer of 3 years old, and a she-goat of 3 years old, and a ram of 3 years old, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he took unto him all these things, and divided them in the midst, and laid each piece one against another. But the birds divided he not. Now again, what is the good side of Hades? What is this? Okay, so Hades, if you read about, Brian's asking about the nature of Hades. If you read in, I believe it's Luke 15 or 16, I'll have to look that up now that you've asked. I'm gonna get the right, so Luke, not Luke 15. So it's Luke 16. In Luke 16, you have the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And in that, you have the rich man and Lazarus both die. The rich man is a wicked man. He's a selfish man. And he ends up in what is called torments. The Greeks called it Tartarus. And then if you look at Lazarus, he ends up in what the story calls Abraham's bosom. They're not in heaven and Gehenna, they're in Hades, the place that the Hebrews called Sheol. This is the place of the dead, the place of the grave, however you want to describe it. And there is a great gulf that separates them, even though there is a way to communicate across it, because the rich man calls out to Abram, of all people, or Abraham, says, Father Abraham, send Lazarus with some water to cool my tongue, because I'm perishing in this flame. And so this is a different place. It's a kind of a holding place waiting for the resurrection and judgment day. And we see another indication of this place when Christ is on the cross. He tells the thief, because of the thief's faith, he says, today you'll be with me in paradise, paradisio. And so the idea of paradise, or Abraham's bosom, is this good side, this place of rest, this place of comfort for the faithful who have died. And when Jesus died on the cross, that's where he went. He went along with the thief to this place of paradise and was there for 3 days. Jesus didn't die, go to heaven, then come back, get resurrected, and then go right back to heaven. That doesn't make any sense. When he died, he went to Hades, the place of the death. And that's why when Peter makes the good confession, you are Christ, the Son of the living God, and he says in Matthew 16:18, he says, you are Peter, and upon this rock, this idea that I'm the Son of God, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades is the Greek word there, not hell, or not Gehenna, but Hades shall not prevail against it. The gates of death are not going to hold back the church. So, yes, Greg, not physical, that's not necessarily the right word, but a real, literal Hades, yes. It's not a metaphor. And it's not purgatory. Purgatory is a Catholic idea. Purgatory does not exist. There's no indication in Scripture of purgatory. But Hades is definitely a real place. It's talked about as it's a real place all throughout the Bible. The Hebrews called it Sheol. You can talk about it. You can just do a word search, and it's all over the Old Testament. Hades, if you have to get kind of a modern translation or get into the Greek. Most of the time you see the word hell, it actually is looking at Hades. And that's actually a correct translation. We can get into the etymology of the word hell. But Hades is this place of the dead, the waiting place until resurrection and judgment. So, Brian, you're quoting Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a book of poetry, in a sense, kind of like an Edgar Allan Poe kind of poetry, and it is hyperbole. There's a lot of hyperbole in there. And the idea is that the dead do not experience the physical world anymore. When it says that the dead know nothing, it's really referring to the idea that they don't interact with the physical world anymore. Not that they are completely brainless, mindless. I know that there's a lot of people who believe that when you die, you're just dead, and you just kind of stop existing except for atoms. But that's not the way that Luke 16 presents it. So, all right. So, I think that covered the question. I want to make sure. That covered that question. And then Stephen says, Romans 4:5-6, but to him who does not work, but believes on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is accounted to him for righteousness, just as David also describes the blessedness of the man to whom God imputes righteousness apart from works. And then, Romans 4 teaches that during the times of Abraham before the law, as well as David under the law, men have always been saved by faith, by obedient faith. That's exactly right. And then you also have this idea of the works in Romans 4 that Paul is talking about are specifically the works of the law. The works of the Mosaical law, which could not save. These were there. You have to understand there's 4 different kinds of works that are talked about in the Bible. There's works of merit, which are, hey God, I did this thing, you owe me salvation. There is works of the law, which I obeyed Moses, and so you owe me salvation. Both of those are kind of works of the law. To be able to be saved under the law of Moses, you had to keep it perfectly without sin. We only have record of Jesus doing that. And so that doesn't help you. There's works of the devil, obviously don't save you. And then there's works of obedience, which have nothing to do with earning anything. And so you have to be careful when when you're reading through and you see the word works in the Bible. You have to understand contextually what kind of works are being talked about. because we are, the salvation is not a thing to be earned. There's no works that we can do that say, God, you owe me salvation. But there are works that we must do to access God's grace, not because they earn anything, but because God said, hey, you have to do this to access my grace. And so Romans 4 there that Stephen posted up is definitely about the works of the law of Moses. So, yes, and there's a whole lot of them revealing themselves right now, Stephen. So, yeah, no, absolutely. Genesis 15:6, you're exactly right. It makes sense, and I don't mind at all. So he's taken all of these animals and he's going to sacrifice them. And so he's done the things that God has said to do. And when the fowls came down upon the carcass, we're talking like vulture type stuff, Abram drove them away. And then when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him. So he has this nightmare. And he said unto Abraham, this is God talking, know of a surety that your seed will be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, and thou shalt be buried in a good old age. Now I want to stop there. There are a lot of people that say that the Israelites, after they go into Egypt, when in the time of Joseph and in the time of Jacob, from that point to the time of Moses is 430 years. Because they read this and then they get that in their mind, and then all of the other details related to it kind of stop. That's not what this is saying. Know of a surety that your seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. When do the offspring or the descendants of Abraham inherit this land? It is not in the lifetime of Abraham. It is not in the lifetime of Isaac. It is not in the lifetime of Jacob. And so any of Abraham's seed that we can talk about, including Isaac, are going to be sojourners in they're going to be strangers in a land that is not theirs. So this countdown starts now. As soon as Abraham has Isaac, we start. And so there are strangers in a land that is not theirs, and then eventually we get to this idea of Egypt and how they're enslaved. And the reason I bring that up, I have an article on my website called 430 Years of Slavery. You can look it up and read. But as we go through Genesis and get into Exodus, you will see that there is more to this. There's more detail to this. So verse 16, and this is where it really gets crazy. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. The fourth generation. Well, what is this fourth generation? What is this talking about? It's not the fourth generation from Abraham, because that's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then you have the 12 tribes, the 12 patriarchs, right? Well, they go into Egypt. So it's not the fourth generation from Abraham. What it is it's actually the fourth generation, starting with those patriarchs, those 12 brothers that go into Egypt are the first generation. And then they only have 3 more generations that follow after Moses and his are the fourth generation. They aren't in Egypt for 430 years. Yeah, the 430 years begins in Genesis 21, 8, and 9. Not in the days of like the end of Genesis, when we start talking about them going in Egypt. Genesis 21, 8, and 9. So the child grew and was weaned, and Abram made a great feast on the same day, and Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, sojourner is a great word. I really like that word. So keep in mind the fourth generation, and I will show, when we get there, I will show you the names going from Levi to Moses, and we will see the 4 generations by name. And there's no way to cram 430 years or to stretch 4 generations into 430 years. It's like Peter Jackson taking The Hobbit, which is a little thin book, and turning it into 3 movies. is what you have to do there. And it just doesn't work. It worked for The Hobbit. I like the movies, but it doesn't work here for 430 years stretched just across 4 generations. Man doesn't live long enough at this point to do that. And then he says why this is going to happen. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, going all the way down, all the way through all of these people to the end of the 4th generation after Joseph and his brothers. It happens that they don't get the land until they come out, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. God is waiting to give the Amorites the opportunity to repent, to really change their ways, is what he's doing. But also, being an omniscient God, he does know that they're not going to. And so he waits and he gives them opportunity. And then the Israelites come out. And remember, that's who Moses is writing to. And he's literally telling the Israelites when they're wandering in the wilderness, hey, this is you guys we're talking about here. The Amorites at the time, they weren't fully evil. Now they are. And you guys are going to have to deal with them. So, oh yeah, prophecy is extremely beautiful. God is so precise. It is amazing. And when you understand the Bible from Genesis to Revelation as a completed whole, that it's not just this disjointed memory verse kind of concept where we learn a few things here and a few things there and they're all compartmentalized. When you understand the Bible as this tapestry all interwoven together, it just becomes a transformation for you. You understand to a level that nobody will ever be able to convince you that the Bible is wrong, that God doesn't exist. That once you get there, it's not possible. It's amazing how well the Bible interprets itself and interacts with itself. So, hi Holly, welcome aboard. All right, so verse 17, and it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and a burning lamp that passed between those pieces. In the same day, I'm guessing the way this is worded is that this is not Abraham doing this. The smoking furnace and the burning lamp, I'm guessing, is God accepting the sacrifice. So, in the same day, Jehovah made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto your seed have I given this land, from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates. The Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Rephaims, there's your giants again, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So he makes a covenant. What is a covenant? A covenant is a contract. It is a promise, but it's a conditional promise. Whenever we see the word covenant, we think contract. Whenever we see this idea of God making a covenant with mankind, it is always, always, always conditional. Always conditional. And in this case, it is conditioned already upon Abraham's faithfulness. Abraham has done the things that God has asked him to do. And so God is saying, since you have done this, I will now do this. And so God keeps that promise. We'll see later in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 that God is going to extend that covenant in its nature with the Israelite nation. And he says, if you obey me, I'm going to bless you beyond anything you can imagine. If you disobey me, I'm going to eliminate you. I will wipe you off the face of the earth. Guess what the Israelites do for almost the entirety of their existence? Disobedience after disobedience. It's just the Old Testament is replete with their disobedience. So what does God eventually do? They fulfill their purpose. They bring Messiah into the world. Then they murder him, and God wipes them off the face of the planet. There is no more Israel in the biblical sense. They don't have a temple anymore. They don't have the documents the legal documents according to Moses. If you read in the book of Numbers, that bring them back to Abraham genealogically, they don't do the sacrifices anymore. There's nothing left of Israel from the biblical perspective, and God fulfilled his promise. He fulfilled the condition. So we'll get there. We'll get to Leviticus and Deuteronomy eventually one day, and we'll talk more about that as we get there. So, all right. So the river of Egypt. A lot of people want to say, well, that's the Nile. That's not what we see. That's not the only river of Egypt. What it's talking about is the border river of Egypt. And if you look at a map and you look at, there's the Sinai Peninsula. There is a river that a lot of people think is the one that the Israelites crossed. It's in kind of all the movies and stuff like that. And then there's another on the other side that they had to cross to get there. That's the one that is the border of Egypt, and it's the border of the Israelite nation. And so they butt up against Egypt, and they interact with Egypt all the time. Also, just a brief thing, because we're going to get there in Exodus, the wandering in the wilderness, a lot of times I've seen growing up that the wandering in the wilderness was supposed to be in the Sinai Peninsula. And if you read the details and you read the specifics, that's not actually true either, because when they come into the Promised Land finally after wandering, they actually have to cross the Jordan. Well, to cross the Jordan, you have to come from the east going west. And so they weren't wandering in the Sinai Peninsula area. They were wandering in what we call Saudi Arabia. I don't know the name, Stephen. I would have to look at a map, and I didn't bother to do that before I got started tonight. I know the location of it. I know what it looks like. I just didn't bother to look up the name. So possibly we can look it up and put it in the comments when we're done here. What's interesting is that during that 40 years of wandering, they were out in that Saudi Arabia peninsula. Well, after Saul gets converted, he goes for 3.5 years into that same area to receive the same teachings that the other apostles that had been with Jesus from the beginning received. And so he's kind of out there, and that is during the quote-unquote 40 years of wilderness wandering for the church that we see about in 1 Corinthians 10. And so there's a lot of beautiful parallels that we see there. So Moses is out receiving the law, wandering in that area. Paul eventually is out wandering, and he's receiving the new law, the law of Christ, and he is the writer of most of the books of the New Testament. So thanks, Mom. Yes, the Nega. I guess that's how you pronounce that. All right. So let's get into chapter 16 here. It says, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. What did they receive? What did who receive, Greg? I'm not sure what the question is. I think I'm missing the context of your question. I'll let you post up the answer and answer it when you get to it. So we have here a woman who is an Egyptian. She's a handmaid. She's kind of a lady in waiting, if you will, a bondservant woman. And her name was Hagar. And what's interesting here is we see an interbreeding. And whenever the Israelites do an interbreeding thing, it's never good for them. Well, I say never. Oh, what did they receive? What did the apostles receive? The apostles received the gospel. So while Jesus was walking around on the earth, his ministry was 3.5 years. He starts his ministry by calling the original 12 apostles. And so they are with him the whole time, receiving his teachings. And then in John 14 through 17, he tells them, look, I'm going to go away and I'm going to send the Holy Spirit. And when the Holy Spirit has come, he's going to help you remember everything that I've taught you. So they didn't have to try to recall it on their own. And that's where we get the inspired word. Well, Saul of Tarsus was not called to be an apostle until years later. And Jesus personally selects him out and says to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And then he turns him into an apostle. He says, I'm Jesus that you persecute. And he turns him into an apostle. And in Galatians, we read that he spends 3.5 years, that he leaves immediately after being converted, after his immersion into Christ. He goes away for 3.5 years into Saudi Arabia and gets the same teaching from Jesus. Jesus actually sits there with him and talks to him directly and says, all right, this is the same thing I taught the other guys, but the other guys are going to be the apostles to the Jews. You are going to be the apostle to the Gentiles. And so that's what they received. They received the gospel. So anyway, we see this mixing here of the Egyptian and the Hebrew line in Hagar. And Sarai, verse 2, and Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now Jehovah has restrained me from bearing. I pray you, go into my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarah. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. See, here we are, 10 years. He left at 75, and he is not quite 85 yet. And gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And that word wife there is actually probably better translated as concubine. But the idea here is that he gave her to her not to marry, but he gave her to him to do the husband and wife thing. So to know her in the biblical sense, not to marry her. Okay, and so he went in unto Hagar, she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Now, I want to make a point here, and this is going to go to Matthew 15. God had made a promise. Sarai is obviously aware of that promise, but Sarai doesn't trust God to do it in God's time and God's way. And so Sarai tries to help God out. And whenever mankind decides to help God out and do it his own way, it's always a disaster. And we see this in Matthew 15. People want to talk about, all of these denominations exist. You guys can't agree on anything. Well, all of the denominations in the world exist because mankind is arrogant, thinking that they can help God the way that Sarai helped God. If mankind would do things only the way that God has said to do it, without adding or taking away anything, there would only be the church. There would be the one church that Jesus built. There wouldn't be any denominations. The Catholicism built on man's greed for power. Everything that the Catholic Church is and exists today is about man trying to grab power. And he does it through a corrupted version of the church. The Reformation movement and all the denominations that sprang out of it, they were reforming the Catholic Church. They're called Protestants. Their very existence depends upon the idea of the Catholic Church existing. They are protesting the Catholic Church. If there was no Catholic Church, they wouldn't have anything to protest. And so what they did is they swung the entire opposite way of the pendulum, going from a meritorious works-based salvation that the Catholics teach to no works at all, faith only saves you, clear violation of James 2, because they don't understand that there's 4 different kinds of works. And so you have all of these people trying to help God, and in Matthew 15 it says that in vain they worship God, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. And goes on to say a little bit later in verse 13 there in Matthew 15 that every tree that God hasn't planted, which is basically all but one, is going to be rooted up. And here we have the first example of man trying to help God, and it does not turn out well, and it never does. We should trust God to do things in his time and his way. So verse 5, and Sarai said unto Abram, My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. Jehovah judge between me and thee. So Sarai is blaming Abram for this. Wow. That's kind of rough. Let's see, done to me be on you. So Sarai, here's the situation. Sarai is looking with contempt on Hagar, but Sarai, through jealousy or whatever, sees Hagar, giving birth to the bondage. Galatians 4 is so powerful. but Hagar is actually looked down on by Sarai. It's the other way around from the way that Sarai promotes it to Abram. And so the contempt is Sarai's for Hagar, but she says that Hagar is looking at me with contempt, and you need to deal with this, Abram. This is your fault. You did this. You need to take care of it. And so Abram backs off. He's like, all right, behold, thy maid is in thy hand, do to her as it pleases thee. Because Abram knows it was Sarai's idea in the first place. So he's like, all right, fine, you do whatever you want. It was your idea in the first place. I don't care. And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her face. So Hagar is gonna run. And here we go. Verse 7. This is going to be an unpopular opinion. And the angel of Jehovah found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way of Shur. So in the Hebrew, the word angel is malak. And malak is the same as the Greek word agalos, and it just means messenger. The messenger of Jehovah found her by a fountain of water. And I'm going to posit to you that the angel of Jehovah that we read about here and in many other places is actually the theophany. It's actually God the Son interacting with mankind before he becomes Jesus. Jesus is the human God the Son after he is born of Mary, but before that he exists in eternity. And so we're going to see this angel of Jehovah over and over and over again. But watch the way that the angel of the Lord converses with Hagar. He refers to himself as God. He refers to himself as, I'm the one that's going to do this. I'm the one that's going to take care of you. I'm the one that's going to bless you. But it's God that is the one that's doing that. And so the angel of Jehovah the messenger of Jehovah is God. But it's God the Son. Okay? So, and he said, verse 8, and he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, whence camest thou? Or from where did you come? And whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. And the messenger of Jehovah said unto her, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands. And the messenger of Jehovah said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. So here, the angel of the Lord said, I will multiply thy seed. Well, who's the only one that can do that? A mere celestial angel like Gabriel can't do that. Only God can do that kind of blessing. And so the angel of the Lord, the messenger of Jehovah, says, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. So she's going to have descendants that are innumerable to the people of this time period. And the messenger of Jehovah said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shall bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael. Anytime you see the word El on the end of a name, that's something of God. That El is the singular form of Elohim, which is God. And so Ishmael, because Jehovah hath heard thy affliction. And so there's that word affliction, and that is directly tied into the name Ishmael. Let's go here to verse 11. Oops, wrong chapter. I'm still in 15 on my Hebrew stuff. So if you look at the word Ishmael, the meaning of it is God will hear, because God heard her affliction. And so we see this tied in directly. Ishmael is directly tied into that affliction, which Stephen was talking about in Genesis 21 a little bit later on, which we'll get to in a few nights. So Ishmael is God will hear, because Jehovah has heard thy affliction, and he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And if that doesn't sound like the Middle East. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. So this is a nation that's the Ishmaelites, this is a nation that's going to rise up. And it's not one of those that is on the list of the wicked that Israel has to wipe out when they take the land of Canaan. That these people were going to last throughout this whole time period of the Israelites, and they exist today. This is what we see the the core or the beginning of the Muslims. Now, Islam, that's a religion, that's not a race, so you can't be racist by saying something negative about Islam. But Muhammad and his people, those Middle Eastern people, are the descendants of the Ishmaelites. And so this idea of his hand will be against every man and every man's hand against him, they haven't changed. In centuries, they haven't changed. They're the same as they have been. So, and she called the name of Jehovah that spake unto her, Thou God. So who's speaking to her? Well, it's the messenger of Jehovah. But who's she talking to? She's talking to God. Thou God seest me, for she said, Have I also looked after him that seest me? So an angel of the Lord and God and Lord are all being used interchangeably here, because the angel of the Lord, the messenger of God, is that theophany. This is pre-incarnate Jesus. Later on, and this is where some of you are probably going to freak out, but I have an article about this on my website, we'll learn that this is actually Michael the Archangel. That Michael is not a mere angel, he's actually God the Son, but that was his name before that time. What's an ignorant statement, Stephen? You'll have to clarify, because I'm not sure what you're referring to. So she called the name of Jehovah that spake unto her, Thou God seest me, for she said, Have I also looked here after him that seeth me? Speaking of those who refer to Islam as a race, it's not a race. Absolutely, exactly correct. Verse 14, we get to have some fun names here. Wherefore the well that she's at this well. The well was called Beer Lahai Roi. Beer Lahai Roi. Hold my Beer Lahai Roi. That's fun. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Moses is writing, and he's communicating to the Israelites, so they know where this is. It's between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael, because God had heard. And Abram was 86 years old. So that's 86 when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abraham. So he's 85 when the deed was done, 86 when Hagar bare Ishmael. So we're now 11 years out from him leaving Ur. Note, from Genesis 12 to Genesis 16, we're only talking about 11 years. Look at all of the things that have happened. He left Ur. He is out wandering in this area with Lot. Lot goes out to, he goes to Egypt and deals with the king there. Calls Sarai, this is my sister, not my wife. Or he doesn't say not my wife. He just says, this is my sister. And then he splits up with Lot. Lot goes over to Sodom and Gomorrah area. There's a kind of mini war between the city-states, and Abram goes and saves Lot and takes out the 4 kings. And now all of this with Hagar. This is just 11 years. This is fast and furious. All of this stuff is happening so rapidly. But Abraham is also what for him is the middle of his life. But he already calls himself an old man. And so he retains, think of him being in the health of a 60-year-old, but then think of him holding on to that health for decades, because that's what we're going to see. He's 86 years old when this happens. Now we're gonna move forward here through time. Abraham doesn't have Isaac for several more years. By the time he has Isaac, Ishmael's a teenager. And so that's important to understand. So that's Genesis 15 and 16. Thank you guys for the questions. Thank you for the comments. I have no more to add to tomorrow night. Lord willing, we will continue on. I might do another 2 chapters. I like doing 2 chapters a night when I have the time to do that, because I don't feel like I'm just dragging my feet going through these. So hopefully we can do 17 and 18 tomorrow night, and then moving on from there Saturday night. So again, thank you, and we will see you guys next time.